Welcome to another module of the Budget app. In this module, our goal is to fix performance issues and reuse the code to reduce the total number of the lines of code. From my experience, in any startup, the functionality of the product is a priority. Then comes the performance optimization. And finally, the areas where the codes can be reused. When it comes to the last point, let me clarify it a bit more. While coding the app, reusing is kept in mind but not looked really carefully at. So finally, when there is a chance after meeting deadlines, developers recheck if any code can be reused. And that's what we're gonna do here. Let us start with the performance fix. Before we make any changes to the document, I want to show you what exactly the problem with the app is. Let me open the responsive handler file, and I'm gonna print here rebuild checker and restart the app. Let's wait for a while. Now that the console popped up, we can observe a funny thing there. That is the fact that the rebuild checker keeps on printing indefinitely. So, what does it mean? It means that our build function is rebuilding itself without any reason, and this is consuming a lot of resources. And we want the build function to be rebuilt only when it's necessary. That means make it rebuild itself only if any value of a variable changes. Now, let me tell you the root cause of the problem. It is actually the isLoggedIn function. It's using the alt state changes stream from Firebase to change the value of isSignedIn. The way we have called the stream is the main problem here, because of which we are facing this issue. We had other streams like the incomes and expenses streams, but we never faced the same problem because we made sure that we were calling the streams only once using this isLoading variable, which turns false as soon as the function runs once, therefore preventing it from running again till the app restarts. We wish we could apply a similar strategy here in isLoggedIn, but it's not gonna work. Let me show you what I mean, and then you'll see why it is so. I'm just going to replace watch with read. So according to the RiverPod documentation, the difference between these two is that read only checks the provider once, and watch checks the function provider continuously for changes. Let's go ahead and restart the app and wait for it to load. Well, you will see that the text is not printing continuously anymore, but another problem has been created just now. Let me try to log in to the app now. I'm gonna put my email here and the password to my account and press login. As you can see, we're still on the same page, but on the console it says login successful. So even though we are logged in, the isSignedIn variable is not getting updated. And that's the reason why we are not redirected to the expense page. we continuously need to check the state of off-state changes. So the strategy of replacing watch with read won't work here. Therefore, let me revert the changes now. The ideal solution over here, according to the RiverPod documentation, would be to create a stream provider to access the stream of state changes and then call it in the responsive handler. So let me comment out this function as we won't need it anymore, and also comment out the isSignin variable as well. Now I'm gonna write the line to access the off-state changes from the stream provider. So let's add stream here, and its type is gonna be user. User type comes from the Firebase package itself. We want to put here get and give it a name off-state change, and this will return off.offState changes. If you need to refresh your memory of this exact way of using the function, go and check out the Advanced State Management module where it's explained in detail. Now that we're done over here, we need to create a stream provider, and this is exactly how we do it. Final of state provider. Inside it, let's call a stream provider and set its type as user. This will return a rev.read view model. Notice that we should only access the stream using the view model provider which we created earlier. Now let us write dot of state change. Make sure to write read instead of watch, as over here we only need to read the stream. Going back to the responsive handler, we don't need any of these lines, as we have an extra variable used here called isSignedIn. So let me comment them out. Instead, what we are going to do is create a variable of state and call the provider. So let's write ref.watch and pass the off-state provider in brackets. Next, I am going to return offState.when. We can see that there are a few properties to fill out here. So in the data property, I'm going to create a function with data as the parameter. Now we need to check if the data does not equal null. This means that if there is some user logged in, we need to pass the entire expense view layout builder. So let me copy this part and paste it over here. If the above statement is false, we are going to return the login page. So let's copy it and paste it here. Now we also need to fill out other properties. Let's start with the error one, which accepts E and trace. We are not going to use these variables, but if we don't write it, we will get an error. And we are going to return the login screen as well. For the loading, let me create a function. I am just going to return the login page part here too. Now, let's go ahead and comment out the dead code as it's not necessary. it's time to stop the app and run it again. It's gonna take a few minutes, so be patient. And it showed up. We are already on the expenses page because we logged in before. So let me log out. And now, as you can see on the console, the rebuild checker is not getting printed indefinitely, which suggests to us that the app is not rebuilding itself without any reason. So voila! We fixed this performance issue and learned a bit more about Stream Provider and how to use it. In this part, we are going to reuse the code from the login page. So I've already opened the login view mobile, and let's see what are the exact lines of code we can reuse here. So the email field and the password field are the same for both the login view mobile and login view web. So why can't we create a single widget and call it in these two files? So here's a challenge for you. Create a single widget in the components file and then use it where it's needed. Pause the video and try it out yourself. Congratulations if you have succeeded. If you haven't, no problemo. You sure have more experience now. Let me copy these entire lines, go to the components file, and create a class called email and password fields. It's gonna extend Hook Consumer widget. Let's create the missing build function with the shortcut. Now, inside the build function, we need to return a column, and in its children, we are going to paste the widgets we copied earlier. And it's time to go to the view web file. Let us copy the view model and use text editing controllers. And paste the lines in the components file. Let us not forget to import the packages. Both the email field and the password field are also going to be used with the register and login button widgets. And of course, we want to reuse the login and register buttons as well. Therefore, we will be creating another class in the components file soon. Now, in order to access the email and password fields from the register and login class, we need to put them outside this class. Since we're not declaring the email and password fields inside the Hook Consumer widget, we don't need to use the Use Text Editing Controller. We can just use a simple text editing controller. The reason we had a Use Text Editing Controller before is because the text editing controller doesn't hold the value of the text editing field when declared inside the build function. That is to say, every time the build function updates, the text editing controller is declared from the beginning, and everything we have written in the text field goes away. So that's why we needed to put the Use Text Editing Controller. But here we don't need it. And also we can't even use it as we will get a dispose error. This means that Now, if we tried to write something in the field when using a use text editing controller, which would be outside the build function, once we typed the first letter in the field, the state would automatically be disposed of, and it would show us an error. Alright, so changing the subject, it is worth mentioning that in some mobile phones, the size box can overflow because of its huge width. So remember that you can always change its width according to the size of the device. Going back to the login view web, let me remove the two text editing controllers from here. Next, I'm gonna remove these three widgets. And I am going to call the email and password fields in their place. Let's do the same for the login view mobile. That is to say, replace these widgets with email and password fields, and we're done. Finally, let me remove the text editing controllers from here, as they are not required here either. Moving on, the register and login button rows are actually the same for both mobile and web. So here's another challenge for you. Create a custom widget in the components file and use it in the login web and login mobile files. Pause the video and try it out yourself. Now let's check if you did it correctly or if your code still needs a tad bit of tweaking. So we're going to start by copying this entire row. Then let's go to the components file and then create a class called register and login, which extends the WhoConsumer widget. Next, let's create the build function. And it's necessary to return the row which we copied earlier. Lastly, let me copy the view model file and paste it over here. And everything looks good. Now at this point, I'm gonna go to the login view web and remove this row. And in its place, call the register and login widget. Let's do the same for the login view mobile. Cool! The next part is the Google sign-in. The medium size for the mobile, and for the web it's large, but I'm positive large is going to look great for both of the devices. So I'm just gonna go ahead and copy the entire sign-in button. Next, I'm going to click on the components file and create a class named Google Sign-in Button, which extends the WhoConsumer widget. I also have to create the build function and return the sign-in button. Let's import the files now. Copy the view model provider and paste it over here. And let's not forget to put a semicolon here. The next thing to do is to replace a widget in the login view web. So let me delete this sign-in button and put the Google sign-in button instead. And it's important to do the same for the login view mobile. Finally, we can go ahead and stop the app and run it again. Also, run it on Google Chrome as well. Let's wait for a while for it to load. And it showed up. So let me try to log in with my credentials. And it's successful. Apologies for the pixelated emulator. I'll use my phone next time. As it works, let's open Chrome now. Let me fill in the email address and the password. And voila, we have successfully logged in. Let me also try to sign in with the Google account from the emulator. And as you can see, it's successful as well. Now, you sure have noticed that the drawer of the mobile version and the drawer of the web version are the same. Therefore, we will be creating a single class for the drawer of both the mobile and web versions of our expense view. To do this, let's first open the expense view for the web version and copy the code for the drawer. Next, we are going to navigate to the components folder and create a new class called Drawer Expense Hook Consumer Widget. Inside this class, we need to implement the necessary overrides and return the drawer. Now, we have to copy the view model from the previous file and paste it into this one. Once we have imported all of the necessary packages, we can move forward with the integration of the drawer into our expense view for both the mobile and web versions. Great! Now that we have created a single class for the drawer of both the mobile and web versions of our expense view, let's go to the expense view for the web and delete the old drawer code. In its place, we want to call the drawer expense widget that we've just created. Next, we're going to go to the expense view mobile and replace the old drawer code by calling the drawer expense widget here as well. Once we have done this, we can run the app to see if both drawers are functioning properly. If everything is working as expected, we can be confident that we have successfully integrated the drawer into our expense view for both the mobile and web versions. Another thing you may have noticed is that the title of the web app displayed on the tab reads localhost instead of the desired budget app. Let's fix this by going to the main.dart file and modifying the title property of the material app widget. To do this, we simply have to write budget app. When we restart the app, we should see the updated title displayed correctly. Thanks to this small change, the user will now see Budget App as the title of the web app. In the next step, we will log into the app and observe that The Add Income and Add Expense buttons are similar in both the mobile and web versions. However, the buttons are a bit smaller in the mobile version. To encourage the reuse of code, we can increase their size on mobile without compromising the overall design. So, to reuse the code for these buttons across both mobile and web, we will create two separate classes. One for the Add Expense button and one for the Add Income button. By creating these classes and reusing the code, we can customize the size and appearance of the buttons for each platform whenever it's needed, while still maintaining a consistent look and feel across the app. To start, we are going to open the Expense View Web file and locate the Add Expense widget. Once we have found it, we will copy the entire widget code. Next, we need to navigate to the Components file and create a new class called Add Expense that extends WhoConsumer widget. Inside this class, we are gonna implement the necessary overrides and return the size box widget that we've copied earlier. In order to complete the Add Expense class, we will also need to include the view model. To do this, we have to copy the view model code from the class above and paste it within the build function of the Add Expense class. Now that we're done over here, we can go ahead and do the same for the Add Income. So this is a very small challenge for you, as it's gonna take you less than a minute. Do it on your own without looking at the video, and then check if it works properly. If it does not work, don't worry. Just follow along with the video. To begin, we're gonna open the Expense View Web file and locate the size box widget for the Add Income button. Once we have found it, we can go ahead and copy the entire widget code. Next, we want to navigate to the Components file and create a new class called Add Income that extends WhoConsumer widget. Inside this class, we need to add a build function and delete any unnecessary code. In addition, we are going to return the size box widget that we copied from the Expense View web file. Furthermore, we are gonna add the view model provider just like we did it before. Finally, I'm going to go to the Expense View web, as I need to start by replacing the size box with Add Expense. I'm also gonna replace the next size box by calling the Add Income. Next, let's go to the Expense View mobile and do the same. That is to say, call the Add Expense and Add Income classes in their respective lines. I'm gonna rerun the app now and log in. You can observe that everything is in order. In the next step, we will be ensuring the use of MVVM architecture by moving the calculate function to the view model file. We're doing it because any business logic should be contained within the view model, while the view files should only contain UI elements. By moving the calculate function to the view model, we can also improve the efficiency of our code by reducing redundancy. Currently, we are using the calculate function twice, so by moving it to the view model, we can eliminate the need for the duplicate code. This will make our app more streamlined and easier to maintain in the long run. So I'm gonna start by copying the calculate function from here and then pasting it in the view model file. Let me delete the view model provider prefixes from these lines as they're no longer necessary. Next, we have to initialize our variables. We are going to need to set both total expense and total income to 0. And also create a budget left variable. It's important to set these values to 0 because if we didn't do that, every time the calculate function ran, we would end up with incorrect or cumulative values. Finally, we need to call the notify listeners functions. Let's not forget that it needs to call the calculate function whenever there is a change in the database. To make this happen, first we are going to go to the expenses stream lines of code, and here we can call the calculate function that we copied just a moment ago. Make sure that you add it exactly here, as it's necessary that the calculate function work only after all the data has been sent to the list. The next step would be to go to the income stream function and call the calculate function here as well. This will ensure that the calculation is done only when there is new data available. Now, let's move on to cleaning up our expense view app and expense view mobile files. We can start with the expense view web. So let us remove the calculate function and any related variables from the function. Also, it's time to use the view model provider to access all the free variables because they're stored in the view model now. Once we're done over here, let's go to the expense view mobile and do exactly the same. Finally, let's test our app to make sure everything is working as expected. Add an expense called coffee, for which we paid $2, for example, and an income named Christmas, and set its value as $24. You should see the data update in real time, indicating that our changes have been successful. So this works perfectly fine, but have you noticed that the total calculation container is almost identical for both the web and mobile versions of our app? The only difference is the font size. So you know what you have to do now. You can pause the video and create a custom widget for total calculation. Okay, now it's time for me to do it. As we're currently in the expense web file, we can go ahead and copy this row from under the total calculation comment. Let's switch over to the components file then and create a new class called total calculation. This class will obviously extend the WhoConsumerWidget class, which will allow us to bind our variables to the widget state and use them in our calculations. Now that we've got the basic structure of the class, we can go ahead and start adding the necessary variables and logic. So next, we're gonna add the build function using the missing override warning. We also need to return the row widget that we copied earlier. To do this, we simply have to type return and paste the row. This will display the total calculation data in our widget. Now, let's create a variable called size to set the size of the text. This variable will be passed to the constructor of the total calculation class. By doing this, you'll create the basic structure of the constructor, and you can then add any additional variables or logic if you need. Once you have the constructor total calculation set up, you can copy the viewModel variable from the above class and paste it inside the build function of the total calculation class. This will allow you to access the necessary data and use it in your calculations. Now let's move forward with the total calculation class. We should start by clicking on this column where we can see some Poppins text widgets inside. To customize the font size, we simply need to replace the 17.0 value with the size variable that we created earlier. It's important to do it for all of the Poppins text widgets in the column. Next, we're gonna need to do the same thing for the rest of the Poppins widgets in the row. Simply locate each instance of 17.0 and replace it with the size variable. With these changes in place, our custom widget should be fully functional and ready to use. To test it out, let's go to the expense web view file and replace the row widget with the total calculation widget and pass in a value for the size variable, that is 17.0, to customize the font size. Finally, let us run the app and verify that the total calculations data is displayed correctly for the web version. If everything looks good, we can move on to the expense view mobile file and repeat the process for the mobile version of the app. To finalize the custom widget, make sure to pass a value of 14.0 for the size variable when using the total calculation widget in the expense view mobile file. This will customize the font size for the mobile version of the app. At this point, you're ready to test the custom widget in the mobile version of your app. go ahead and run the app and verify that the total calculation data is displayed correctly. If everything looks good, and as you can see, it does look perfectly fine, you can move on to the next step of your project with confidence. Let's move on to the next part. In our collections of expenses and incomes, each of the documents has two keys. That is name and amount, right? And for those two keys, we have made these 4 lists. Now, let's say we have dozens of keys in each document. It wouldn't be feasible to create so many lists on our own. And even now that we have only 2 keys in a document, the code doesn't seem to be clean. Instead, what we can do is create a list of classes which will contain all the respective keys and values. Here, I would like to tell you about the model from Model View Model architecture, as it's gonna really come in handy when working on various projects. The model part of the Model View Model is a class that holds the business logic and data of our app. It is a way to separate the data layer from the presentation layer of an app, making it easier to test, use data, and maintain it. Models are often used in conjunction with a database to store and retrieve data. Besides that, we also need to choose a state management solution like Riverpod that will notify the presentation layer when the data changes. In the context of our app, the model can be thought of as a box that is a class holding the data for every single document from one of our collections, that is incomes or expenses. This way, we can create a single list for the expenses to store all the documents from the expenses in the same place. And the same thing happens with the incomes. By doing this, we are making the code cleaner, more readable, maintainable, easy to call in other codes, and finally, we are completing the MVVM pattern. Now, let's just start coding it. Right-click on the lib folder and create a new Dart file called models. For the incomes and expenses, we will need just one model. So I am going to create a class called models. And in the constructor, write required this.name and required this.amount. Let's declare the variables, which will represent the data that is there in each document of a collection. So it will be final string name and final string amount. Now, the data is going to come to us from the Firebase backend in the form of JSON or maps. So we need to convert it and put the data into their respective variables so that we can access each individual data element from the class directly. I'm gonna start by writing factory models. Models is obviously the class of the function. Dot from JSON, which is the name of our function. As you can imagine, the factory constructor is a constructor that can return an instance of a class without creating a new object, which is what we want to do. The parameter is going to accept a map with string and dynamic as the key value pair of the map called the JSON which is one of the data interchange formats. Dynamic means that values can be of any data type. In the function, we want to call the models class, and in the name property, I want to write JSON, name in quotes, and in the amount, I'm going to type JSON and amount in quotes as well. So let me explain once again, but now in more detail. The factory keyword is used to create a constructor that returns an instance of a class. It is often used when a class has multiple constructors that perform different tasks, and you want to provide a single consistent way to create instances of a class. Now, from JSON is the name of the function, and the JSON map represents the document which we will get from the expenses or incomes collection. Moreover, inside the function, we created one instance of the class models, and in its properties we are passing the name and the amount extracted from the JSON variable. And I've got some good news for you. Instead of writing this all by yourself, you can use a code generator like the one I am about to show you now. So you can go to this website called app.quickttype.io and select the source type, then the name of the class and the language. Then write the data which is provided to you from the backend, and this will create the model class for you. You can also choose some properties you would like to customize here and switch them on and off. There are also some extra codes, but for this case, all you need is these lines. Now, this map data is going to be provided by your backend team, but since we are the ones responsible for the Firebase of our app, we need to write it. Also, make sure the type of data that will come from the server is exactly the same as the one you're putting here. For example, if we open Firestore right now and open a document from the expenses collection, you will notice that the amount is actually a string value. But if we go back to the web page, you will sure notice that the quotes are not there, which means that the integer will be received. And if we run this code, we will obviously get an error. So let's fix it by simply enclosing it in double quotation marks, making the data type string. And our code changed accordingly. Once it happened to me that the backend team was sending me the wrong data type. So if we are not sure what the data type is, or if we receive an error in the app, a quick fix for the issue is to use final dynamic amount instead of final string amount. Of course, if you're working with other languages, you can create models for other languages as well. Moving on, let's get back to the view model file and create a list to store each model of the expense. So basically, this list will work like a collection and each model object will work like a document. I'm gonna create a list of type models and name it expenses and initialize it. Let's do another one for the incomes. Now, the program needs to update the lists maintained by incomes and expenses stream functions with new data coming from Firebase. The program will do it by extracting the data from a snapshot object received from Firebase and then adding the data to each list. That's why we need to go to this collection snapshot. The snapshot will obviously come from the server whenever there's an update in the collection. So at this point, we need to extract the documents from the snapshot, which means that we're gonna write snapshot.docs for each. And inside the function, type expenses.add. Let us call models from JSON and pass the element. Let's not forget to write .data. So this way, every time a user adds or deletes some data, a particular document is processed in the from JSON, and the new instance of data is added or deleted from the expenses list. Also, we need to make sure to make the expenses list empty before calling the snapshot.docs, or else the documents are just going to add on top of one another. Next, I'm going to use a logger to print the expense models and pass the list over here to check what we are getting. Let's run it. And then let me search the console for the expense models. And as you can see, we are getting the instances of models. Now, let me see what we will get as the amount of the 0th position of the expenses list. Let's reload it. And the answer is 2, just as expected. Let's try to do the same thing, but with length now. That is the number of the things we spent our money on. And we can see that the length is 3, as it should be. So the model is working perfectly. Next, we're gonna go to the income stream and do the same we did with the expenses. That is to say, in brackets, write snapshot.docs for each. Inside the function, write incomes.add, and in place of the value, call models.fromJSON and pass the element.data. It's also important to make sure the incomes list is empty whenever the below function runs. Once we're done over here, we need to integrate the model into the rest of the app. First things first, I'm going to delete all the previous lists from here as they're no longer needed. So let's look at this error over here. In order to get rid of it, we have to put the new expenses list here instead of the old one, that is the expenses amount list. I'm gonna do the same with the incomes. Next, we need to write expenses here as well. And look carefully how I access the models. The first thing you should notice is that I'm keeping the index I. And then after putting a dot, I'm choosing the piece of data I want to show. We need the amount, so I'm gonna choose the amount one. It's a lot easier to call the data from models, right? And you don't even need to remember what to write within quotes every time you call a list. Here in the total income, we're gonna do the same as we did in the total expense. So let me choose the amount as well. Well, let's go ahead and move on to the next error. That is the unorganized way of putting the data in a list that we don't even need anymore. What we can do here is basically comment out this part. Also, make sure to call notify listeners as the expenses list needs to be updated in the presentation layer. Now, when we scroll down to the income stream, we can also call the notify listeners function here and comment out the rest of the code. Also, let me correct the spelling. And it's time to refactor the rest of the pages. I'm gonna go to the expense mobile view, and in the list view builder, I need to replace expenses amount with expenses. In the text, we need to write expenses as well and add .name. In the amount, besides writing expenses, we have to pass the amount. Let's do the same for the next list view builder. I'm gonna write incomes in the item count, put incomes in text, and tap into the name. Put incomes in the amount, and then tap into the amount. Once we're done over here, we can go ahead to the expense web view, and it's gonna be the same thing here as well. So do it on your own. Also, as these list view builders are quite similar, you can try to type all the data inside them by yourself. Or maybe you can use a single widget. Finally, now that we're done with coding this part, let's stop the app and run it again. Let's log in, and you can observe that everything is working fine. Let me add an income New Year bonus, for example, with an amount of, let's say, $7,000. So it appeared in our incomes. We can also reset it, and it's working perfectly.